second session entitled Regional Context, Trade, Resources, and Environment. And I will take just a couple of minutes to introduce our presenters and then make just a couple of opening observations. We have the privilege today for our keynote speaker for this session to have with us Ambassador John Weeks, who, among other things, in his impressive career, worked with the Canadian government in their negotiations with the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs in the Tokyo and Uruguay rounds. He was also Canada's chief ambassador for the North American Free Trade Agreement negotiations. He then later served as Canada's ambassador to the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, and most recently has served with the law firm of Sidley Austin in their Geneva office until 2003, when he joined his current the law firm of Bennett Jones in Ottawa, Canada. Joining him on the panel today is Dr. Linda Salvucci of Trinity University in San Antonio. She has an emphasis on Latin American history, especially trade and commercial relations, relationships between Latin America and the U.S., and she has published multiple works in academic peer-reviewed journals on that relationship. And she is currently working on a manuscript, entitled Ironies of Empire, the U.S.-Cuba Trade in a New Atlantic World, 1760 to 1868. She's the past recipient of the Conference on Latin American History Prize, as well as the Hubert Herring Award for Best Article, awarded by the Pacific Coast Council on Latin American Studies. Also on the panel is Dr. Stephen Brooks of the University of Windsor. Dr. Brooks teaches political science and has published a number of works, including works on American exceptionalism in the age of Obama, works on Canadian politics, as well as a book entitled Policy Expertise in Contemporary Democracies. He also co-authored with a set of memoirs of Ambassador Paul Salvucci's time in Canada. And so we welcome him also to the panel. This session is on the regional context, trade, resources, and the environment, and you will note that from our earlier session and into the later sessions, you will see a lot of overlap, because we are taking these topics and cutting them in different ways and slicing it different ways to review it. Patterns of trade are critical. As we have already noted, two of the U.S.'s largest trading partners are both Canada and Mexico. Canada is heavily dependent on the United States for trade. And one of the things that we note in comparison, since we've already broached the subject of the European Union, is that the relationship of trade between the United States and Canada, but also Mexico, is very different from the relationship that you find within the European Union. At a Canadian Studies Conference a couple of years ago, I was impressed when the Assistant Finance Minister for the province of Ontario, in addressing the conference, noted that supply chains in the North American automobile industry are about 4 levels deep. So we're not talking about a finished product crossing a border. We're not talking about a component that goes into the finished product crossing the border. We're talking about raw components, base materials crossing. And in fact, she gave the illustration of a dashboard assembly that goes into a Nissan that is finally put together in the United States that crosses the U.S.-Canada border 5 times in the process. While that relationship is very deep, increasingly we are finding that kind of integration between the United States and Mexico. And more broadly, I think hemispherically, we're starting to see a lot more. But trade is not the only other question in terms of when we talk about the regional context. Later on, we'll discuss the issue of investment and foreign direct investment. But when we also talk about resources, we're talking about human resources, movements of persons across borders. If we are going to live in a post-9/11 world and that rhetoric has any resonance a decade later, one of the concerns between the United States and Canada and Mexico is developing, in the long term, I think, a security frontier that encompasses the whole area, if not even more broadly. And then how does that relate to the broader Latin American experience? Obviously, capital flows back and forth across borders, as well as natural resources. And so these are all critical components of the trade. Now, related to that, you also, of course, obviously have concerns about the environment and how that relates, because as goods and services flow across borders, as things are manufactured, we also have ties into resources, including environmental resources. We go not too far south of here, and we see a common shared border on the Rio Grande. And so how countries, both the United States and Mexico, how states that border that international border deal with water resources and environmental regulation have a profound impact on the relationship between the United States and Mexico. And more broadly, pollution doesn't stop at national borders. One of the primary sources of acid rain in southern Ontario is the United States. So as we talk about environmental issues, we have to recognize the trans-border nature of those as well. So those are my comments, and I will now turn it over to my investor leads.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It works. Well, thank you very much, I guess, Pete Murphy. I owe it to you for giving me this opportunity, and I must say I think it's starting off very well, and I look forward to playing my part in it. I think by the end of the day, it will be really interesting to watch the interaction of the different panels, because clearly, as Stephen just said, there's a fair amount of overlap, but I think by the end of the day, that will appear to be a strength rather than a weakness. I was a bit intimidated by this subject. It's pretty broad. Latin America and North America, the future of the relationship, and then the minor issue of regional context, trade, resources, and environment. So it leaves a certain amount of latitude to approach it as you wish. And I decided, well, first of all, I couldn't help but thinking, given that title, thinking about the free trade of the Americas exercise, which clearly had captivated people's attention a few years ago. And we were supposed to have completed that negotiation 8 years ago. I guess theoretically it's still underway, but nobody's doing anything. And it's clear it foundered really because of competing visions, I believe, of the partners. And we've had in the last panel, some of that was already sketched out in terms of the difference of thinking among some of the Mercosur members as compared to, say, the Pacific Alliance. And then, of course, there was a different vision of how to approach it from a North American perspective, where we already had in place the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so it foundered. So then I thought, well, let's go. I always like going to statistics because I think that's a good way of approaching some of these issues. So I thought, let's look at trade of the Americas. How much is there? How much trade is there? And where is it? And given the background we just heard about, my WTO background, I go online. I'm not very good at doing this, but I go online to the WTO, and they've got a lot of very good statistics, and you can pull out some of the way it's arrayed to sort of look at different things. And clearly this is just sort of a scratching the surface of statistically, and I must say it occurred to me that somebody could really go into this in a lot more depth, because you could look at the trends over time, you could look at it from the perspective of different partner countries. I've tended to concentrate on looking at it from a United States perspective, even though I'm Canadian. this is because I thought, well, this presentation is in the United States, and it's supposed to be a keynote address, so I should be looking at it from the big perspective. I also, by the way, although I'm a Canadian, and I still think as a Canadian, and I deal with a lot of things in Canadian policy, the years I spent with Sidley Austin in Geneva, an American law firm, working largely for American clients, also sort of gave me a different way of looking at the world, so for which I'm most grateful, because I think that's what makes life interesting, is coming at things from different perspectives. Well, this is United States trade in 2011, billions of dollars with first South and Central America. And these, by the way, these geographic divisions are ones that are used by the World Trade Organization in their statistics. And just to clarify, North America includes Mexico. Central and South America does not. So I've used their terms rather than using the term Latin America. So looking at U.S. exports to South and Central America, as you can see, they're considerably smaller than the exports to North America. Indeed, they're smaller than the exports to either Canada or Mexico. And I think that really speaks for itself. But basically, U.S. trade with Canada and Mexico is more than 3 times greater than U.S. trade with South and Central America. So I thought, well, let's turn it around and look at it from the perspective of at least one of the major countries in South America. So I picked Brazil for pretty obvious reasons, also because the WTO happens to have this chart for Brazil, not for some of the other countries. So, but Brazil's a good, so I thought this was really very interesting. There's Brazil's exports and imports to and from North America, to and from the United States, which is most of what they do with North America, but clearly not all. And then look at how much bigger their trade is with the rest of South and Central America. But and then look at the EU, if you take the totals. And then China, look at how significant China's become. So then I did it slightly differently. I looked at total merchandise trade, so that's grouping imports and exports, and I did it in ascending order, those same groups. So you've got the United States, considerably less important, for instance, than the EU, less important even than China, and less important than the rest of South and Central America. But it's interesting to see how Brazil has more trade with the European Union than it does with the rest of South and Central America as well. So I then wrote, sobering information for the proponents of regional integration, and then I thought, as I was listening to the last panel, that actually there's more than one way of thinking about this. When I finished the NAFTA negotiations, I was always being asked afterwards, what is the most significant accomplishment of the NAFTA? What's the biggest outcome? And I thought about this because there's a lot of things in there you could say, but I said psychological. Because I think really what the NAFTA did, certainly from a Canadian perspective, and I would argue also elsewhere, but from a Canadian perspective, it changed people's, businessmen's, their way of thinking about doing business in the United States, in North America, including Mexico, and then suddenly they thought, hey, wait a minute, they started working with Mexican partners and looking at this and thinking, maybe I can go beyond Mexico into the rest of Latin America. I think it really started to change the psychology. I think that was more important, thinking that you could compete on an equal footing with Americans and Mexicans throughout the region. That was more important than any of the specific changes that were made. And to a certain extent, you can look at these statistics and say, well, maybe there's not any reason to try to negotiate a free trade agreement in the Americas, because you don't really have the sort of trade dynamics backing up that kind of effort. Or you could say, maybe it's all the more reason to be looking at trying to do something to break down the trade barriers between North and South America. Because what you need is there's obviously a lot of potential. North America is just not involved in it to the degree it should be. So how do we try to shake things up and move forward? Where they put money? Now, I think the other thing, of course, that comes out of those statistics is how important the dynamic is in NAFTA trade. And I thought I was looking around for some recent example of somebody authoritative sort of talking about this dynamic and the need to rejuvenate NAFTA, and I found this letter from the Business Roundtable, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, which is really the Canadian counterpart of the Business Roundtable. And this group, the Consejo, and my Spanish is non-existent, the Consejo Mexicano de Hombre de Negocios, or something like that. And that's a group that's been in existence since really the first efforts to negotiate NAFTA. It was a business group that was very supportive of moving forward with the NAFTA exercise and has been active on some of these trade issues since as well. But they wrote a joint letter to the leaders of the 3 North American countries, really recommending improvements to enhance the international competitiveness of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And I think this is the next parts, and we go on the next slide too with this. You know, they noted how North American supply chains had developed and flourished since NAFTA came into force. And really looking at the quality, variety, price, and availability of goods and services on a regional basis and how that's converged. I think this is really very important, because I'll get in a minute talking about some of the challenges beyond the Americas that I think feedback and inform what we should be doing here in the Americas. But the supply chains are something that we've created, and we need to think about how to build on that, how to foster it, and to make sure that we don't do any damage to that, because that's been very important in our prosperity. And I think is one of the key factors, frankly, that is leading to the onshoring that we're now seeing, of production coming back from China, for instance, to North America, including to the United States. Another thing that was interesting is they looked at some of the factors, some of the sort of measures in this letter of the integration of the North American market. And its size and importance. And I think that's quite striking. 460 million consumers, a quarter of the world's economy, larger than the EU and more than double the size of China. Mind you, China is growing rapidly, but an estimated 14 million jobs in the United States tied directly to trade with Canada and Mexico. And then very importantly, and this is really another way of stating the importance of the supply chains, but and a dashboard that goes back and forth across the border 5 times, half of U.S. exports and imports to and from Canada and Mexico take place between related economies. Now, of course, at the present time, where the United States is focusing, and frankly Canada as well, we just talked about the Canada-EU agreement, is on completing the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and on the negotiations with the European Union. But you know, if you look at the TPP negotiations, this is quite interesting, because this is the first time in 20 years that the 3 North American countries have been sitting down at the same negotiating table with each other. There's some other partners there too. I'll come back to this again later. You know, this negotiation, the TPP, assuming it's successful, the subject matter is basically the same as the NAFTA, but we're negotiating provisions that are going to be somewhat different. So the obligations aren't going to be stated exactly the same way as they are in the NAFTA. Some of them may be different. Some of them may actually be conflicting. And I would suggest that we really need to, as the 3 North American countries, be sitting down to figure out what are we really doing here. We don't want to sort of sleepwalk into a situation where without having planned it, we start doing harm to the North American supply chains. And I think I haven't yet seen signs that we're really approaching this in the 3 North American countries in the sort of coordinated way that I think we should. Now, this slide I found in a paper by the Congressional Research Service. They do very good work on looking at the United States and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I picked this out because I thought this is quite striking. You hear all this talk about TPP. Now, there is a lot of potential there. It could be the template of, 21st century trade agreement. Maybe China will join eventually. But this is who's participating. So you can see U.S. trade. This is merchandise trade. Services would look a bit different. But this is a pretty good measure of the relationships in the trading area. So here are exports and imports with Canada, with Mexico, way bigger than anybody else. And also with Japan, which is significant, but still, as you can see, a lot smaller than either Canada or Mexico. And then other TPP countries. So that's basically, I've said there, I'm being slightly facetious, for the US TPP is mostly NAFTA. But I think this does suggest that, as we approach the TPP, and although the goal is to finish it by the end of this year, I don't think that's going to happen, folks. There's still a lot of serious outstanding issues, and it's going to take, I think, at least another year to move that forward. So there's lots of time still to be thinking about how do we take the necessary decisions to ensure that we're not doing harm to what we've already set up in North America in the way we design this new agreement. Well, I agree this is really what I've said already. Now, I was mindful that I was supposed to talk about resources too, so I thought, well, let's do a statistical look at that as well. Because I was thinking, you think of Central and South America, all those resources, there must be a lot of resources that the United States is getting in that part of the world. Fuel its economy, North America in general. So I thought, well, let's look at that. And again, I must say I was a bit surprised. So, by the way, this category, fuels and mining products, I believe includes oil and natural gas and all those things. This is, again, in the WTO statistics. So I started with the world, because I thought, let's sort of situate it in terms of where the, and I think on this one, because this is really about where is the U.S. sourcing energy and mining products, those that don't come from the United States itself, where are they coming from? And again, this is only 1 year, so anybody who wants to do more research, should be fun to look at trends and so on. But the world imports, so it's a little over $500 trillion in 2011, of which only 98 billion comes from South and Central America. That's still significant, of course, but it's less than 20%. And then you look at what comes from North America. 174 billion, which is nearly double what's coming from South and Central America. It's coming from. So I began to think, well, that's interesting. So this brought me back again to thinking about, do we, and I really commented on some of these points earlier. Do we need an FTAA? Well, maybe we should be thinking about how to have some agreement in the Americas, or some way of breaking down the trade barriers, try and change those sort of really unfavorable trade statistics that these different numbers have revealed. There there must be a lot more potential for more trade in the Americas. Maybe part of it, part of the reason there isn't more is some of those stereotypes that are there that were mentioned in our earlier panel. But I don't see any real likelihood that that the dynamics have changed so that if you were to reinvigorate the FTAA process tomorrow, I don't think we'd be looking at getting an early agreement. So are there alternatives to doing this? First of all, of course, in the TPP negotiations, Chile and Peru are also in that. So, in TPP, there are actually 5 countries in the Americas participating in the TPP. So, maybe eventually more would be interested in coming on board and joining in that exercise. I also like, the Pacific Alliance has already been mentioned earlier. I think it is important to think about the Pacific Alliance. Canada sort of backed away from actually joining the Pacific Alliance earlier this year, I think because we were a little worried about how these countries that we set out, with whom we have free trade agreements with each of them, we was a bit worried about their objective of eliminating all tariffs. We still have this hang-up in Canada on our dairy and poultry sectors where oh my God, don't. We're sworn to defend them with our dying breath. This dwindling part of Canadian agriculture. So I think it's worth though thinking about the role that those countries can play, and they certainly have a very different approach than the Mercosur countries in terms of how they see their role and their integration into the global economy. Now, it hasn't been fashionable recently to talk about the World Trade Organization, but I think, well, maybe the time has come to say, I say here, I think the next few months are going to be very important in terms of the future of the negotiating function of the World Trade Organization in a sort of medium-term context. And there's going to be another WTO ministerial conference in Bali in December. There are a number of issues there, including trying to salvage some of the pieces of the Doha round, including, importantly, a trade facilitation agreement, which could be very important, actually. And the new Director General of the World Trade Organization, he's been there since September, Roberto Azevedo, he happens to be a Brazilian, is playing a very vigorous role with the delegations in Geneva, with the ambassadors and with ministers, in terms of trying to get some positive momentum in the WTO that could lead to some modestly useful results in December. And I think if he's successful in doing that, he and the members, and there's a lot of support among the members who would like to see some progress in the organization, that could help change the perception of whether the WTO is a place where you can actually negotiate trade agreements. After all, historically, a lot of things have been negotiated there, and it still is, in a real sense, the centerpiece of the world trading system. Certainly from a dispute settlement management perspective, it is. So maybe, if we have some success on that front, maybe the way to look at trying to break down barriers in the Americas is by going back to the WTO. Those trade statistics I showed earlier of Brazil really show that Brazil sees itself, it's in a global situation. It has very important trade with the European Union, very important trade with China, important trade with North America, but less so. And you, maybe from their perspective, you want to entice them to coming into a negotiation and taking it seriously. Perhaps the place to do that is in the World Trade Organization. And of course, from the point of view of other Mercosur countries, put Venezuela to one side as a bit of the oddball part of it, which may be imploding, as someone said. I think that certainly, Argentina, which is a bit mercurial in terms of its approach on a number of these policies, but and Uruguay, certainly, and Paraguay, these countries and Brazil all see major benefits in breaking down foreign barriers, particularly on agricultural products in other parts of the world. So they actually have a major strategic incentive for wanting to participate actively in a successful major WTO negotiation. Now, environment. Now, of course, and I was glad this came out at dinner last night because, it's become clear that, well, I remember I negotiated the NAFTA, I was the chief negotiator, and then, of course, you folks down here had an election after we finished the NAFTA negotiations. And I remember watching it very carefully because it was quite important what was going to happen to the NAFTA. We completed the NAFTA while George H. Bush was president. A few days before the Republican National Convention, you may recall, Bush did not win the ensuing election. And a guy called Bill Clinton did, and I remember he made a speech, I forget, it was South Carolina somewhere, where he said that he sort of finally revealed his colors and said, I think the NAFTA is a fine agreement, but it needs to be complemented with provisions on labor and environment before I would put it to Congress. Which turned out to be quite similar to the views that were held by the Canadian Liberal Party, which came to power before the agreement actually finally came into force. But so clearly these issues, and they've been part, they were side agreements in the NAFTA, they're now part of every major trade agreement that is being negotiated. So they're there, whether we like it or not. Now, the Keystone XL pipeline was mentioned last night, and clearly, here's a very interesting example of how trade and energy and resources and environment get sort of thrown up and churned up in the same debate, and we still haven't seen where that's going to come out. I think there have been a fair number of misinformed comments on it made from various quarters. But I won't go into that any further because we could save that for the discussion period. But I also think, and I've thought this for a long time, that a lot of people some people see sort of trade as bad, harmful to the environment. Growth is bad, harmful to the environment. I actually happen to think that trade and the environment, trade can make a positive contribution to the environment. Obviously, it has to be managed in the right way, but I think it's particularly important to try to avoid having these two sides of collision course. And then I just end with a few thoughts on the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. But very broad objectives. The emphasis is very much on cooperation. I think actually it's been a very beneficial agreement. One interesting feature of it is when we started negotiating the NAFTA, everybody thought, people in Canada and the United States thought, Mexico is so dirty and the pollution is so terrible. We really have to do something. And of course, they're able to produce things there more cheaply because they don't have any pollution controls, and there's a whole. And then I remember Jaime Serra was the Mexican trade minister at the time, and I remember being at a meeting with him one day. I guess he was speaking to an audience, and he said, and I hadn't heard him say this before, but I did hear him say it a number of times subsequently. He said, "Who do you think is most concerned with pollution in Mexico?" And then he described a bit, about how bad it was. And he says, "Who do you think is most worried about this?" We Mexicans, that's who are the most worried about this. And it was quite a powerful argument. And we also, so we went from there, okay, that's interesting. And then we started getting into, well, in the side agreements, could we put some teeth into an environmental agreement? So we came up with a sort of, broad obligation that levels of environmental countries would try to keep improving the levels of their environmental protection. Very noble objective, but then the one place where it sort of has some real teeth is each party shall effectively enforce its environmental laws and regulations through appropriate governmental action. So that's still pretty vague, but nonetheless, it is an obligation, and it's related to your environmental laws and regulations. Sounds pretty simple on the face of it. So we started looking at this from a Canadian perspective. What will this actually entail in Canada? I'm sure the United States went through a similar thing. We thought, oh my God, maybe we aren't actually enforcing. What about the Arctic Water Pollution Prevention Act? Are all the Inuit communities really properly respecting what's in here? So we suddenly began to realize that, this environmental agreement might actually, there might be more than just Mexico who could be targeted by these things. And by the time we finished negotiating this agreement, we built in all sorts of things about the kind of persistent behavior that was required before you could run afoul of this obligation and so forth. So I think I end on this note about sanctions, because clearly sanctions have been seen as a useful technique by some for enforcing environmental objectives, but I think they can be easily abused, and I think this is an area where we should proceed with caution.
Dr. Salvucci, did you care to start?
Wow, my head is spinning. I just have millions and millions of questions. I should say I'm coming at this from 3 different perspectives. I think I was invited because of some work that I had done on trade relations between the United States and Cuba and Mexico, but that was for the late 18th and 19th centuries. I'm also coming at this from the perspective, as I was saying to Ambassador Weeks before, of someone who has lived in San Antonio for the past 25 years or so. And the world looks a little bit different from San Antonio than it might look from Ottawa or Washington, D.C. or Mexico City. And number 3, I'm also coming at this from the perspective of just finishing a term as chair of the National Council for History Education. And that leads me to think about these broader issues of public perceptions and educated citizenries and the need for people to really understand the intricacies of what can often be very complicated and complex situations where they might not recognize precisely what their own self-interests are. So I guess one of my first questions is, as someone who is a negotiator, how do you get around those barriers of conflicting interests, not just at the national level, but within the different regions of the country? You alluded to the Inuits, for example, or I'm thinking of people in South Texas now who are all excited about fracking. I mean, fracking is just the thing right now. But every day I'm reading articles in the newspaper and other forms of media about how the roads have worn out because the trucks are too heavy. The water supplies are being contaminated. In other words, how do you get from the national down to a more regional set of considerations, and then how do you juxtapose these competing considerations?
How do you want to? Well, that's a very good question. That you could do a whole course on that.
Really? Yeah.
I think it's, well, of course, the simple answer is to say it works its way through the political process. But the political process works imperfectly, so some interests probably get more say than other interests. In Canada, if you've got an effective provincial government or an effective local member of parliament, then your region's interests are perhaps going to be projected more clearly into the national debate than somewhere else. Similarly, those citizens who are directly affected, if they can articulate it and well, then their interests are going to be given more thought. But I think one thing that all of our countries have done with increasing precision and on a broader scale is get broad advice on the management of trade negotiations. In the United States, you have a mandated system of trade advisors set up by Congress that includes people from the environment, from the non-governmental community as well as business interests. So this is an effort to try to make sure that different views can be aired and given a chance to be brought into the policy-making process. Similarly, congressional oversight, which might actually become more active if the administration got its wish, which they might regret, and I say that partly facetiously, of getting new trade promotion authority, because then the Congress would be directing the administration in terms of how it would like to see its congressional power over international trade managed by the administration on a directed basis, but also subject to regular and ongoing review by the key congressional committees to ensure that the will of Congress is being properly reflected by the administration as it carries that out. So maybe I should stop there.
Could I ask one follow-up to that? And then
with the moderator's permission.
With the moderator's permission. What do you do when you have the imperatives of free trade coming up against the goal of, say, energy self-sufficiency? And again, fracking is very much on my mind at this point because of where I live.
Well, of course, fracking is, that's a domestic issue in a sense. That's not an international trade issue.
Well, but
although by having
is.
more, by
Yeah.
making your market more accessible and building the Keystone XL pipeline or allowing it to be built, you're not being asked to build it. Just all we want is permission. That might lessen the pressure on developing more reserves through fracking, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. But if the goal is to reduce outside dependence on,
right. I don't think, but on that, Canada, by the way, and this is a thank you to Dean this morning for pointing out that Canada is the United States' largest trading partner. We're also the United States' largest energy supplier.
right?
And largest oil supplier. Bigger than Saudi Arabia. I don't think any of, it depends on how optimistic your analysis is about what fracking is really going to lead to, because there's a bit of metaphysics in thinking about how much production it could actually yield. But I don't think that the more sober analysis suggests that the United States, even with all of this activity, is actually going to be energy self-sufficient. So then I think it's a question also of looking at a balance, really. How much self-sufficiency do you need, and how much trade you need? I think I saw something interesting the other day. I think it's if you take the United States trade deficit, which I forget the exact, but it's quite large, as I'm sure you've heard, about half of it is in oil and natural gas. So if you take that out, it all looks very different. And that's something you don't want to stop buying overnight, I don't think. I think we could go on forever. It's a very good question.
Dr. Brooks?
Thank you. Well, let me first of all thank the conference organizers for the invitation. I think I was probably invited because I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Gladys in Windsor about 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was. And we had some really good representation from a number of states outside of Michigan. The annual, perhaps it's biannual, it's not even held anymore, Michigan Association of Canadian Studies meeting was held outside of the country for the first time in Windsor, Ontario, which is right across the Detroit River from Detroit. And so we met at that point. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to come to Houston. Now, I actually was here once, but I didn't get out of the airport.
That's like me.
Well, as I arrived at the airport this time, the very first thing, without a word of a lie, the very first thing that I heard was a boarding call for Air Canada to Calgary, which we Canadians think of as Houston's sister city. It's a city where energy is king, and where the energy companies are in great profusion in Calgary's downtown. And like Houston, from what I hear about Houston, it's also a place where after 6 o'clock the downtown shuts up, everybody's gone, and that's Calgary as well. Everybody heads up to the suburbs, and downtown empties out.
And if I may, Calgary has a nice Mexican population at this point.
Well, that's right. In fact, in this boarding call, they were calling for 4 people to come directly to the flight. 3 of them had Latin American names. Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that actually. So that's the energy connection and the energy affinity between Canada and the United States. Now, I come from Windsor, Ontario. I teach on the Windsor side. I also teach on the American side at the University of Michigan's Dearborn campus, where I teach Canadian politics. And I do their Ottawa internship program. So I cross the border all the time, and I've lived in that area most of my life. And you may or may not know, you probably don't know, there's no reason why you should know, but that is the single busiest border crossing in North America. The Ambassador Bridge, approximately 8,000 trucks cross the Ambassador Bridge every day, including those trucks carrying the dashboards that start small and finish big as they move back and forth and finally make their way into an assembled vehicle. It's enormously important. Certainly this was driven home in the aftermath of 9/11 when the backup of traffic at the Windsor United States border at the Ambassador Bridge stretched for, no exaggeration, 12 to 14 miles for a few days. It was so bad, as the mayor of my fine city often says, I've heard him too many times give this talk, the city had to set up these sort of porta potties, porta johns all over, because the truck drivers, the poor guys, they were stuck in their trucks for 12, 24 hours before they could cross the bridge. Well, that was a really dramatic reminder of how crisis could lead to a critical thickening, really paralysis of the border. And since then, we talk a lot about the thickening of the border, because the crisis has passed, but what hasn't passed are problems in terms of these supply chains. And they work marvelously well, I think, all things considered, especially given just-in-time delivery systems and so on and so forth, where the trucks have replaced the warehouses and so on and so forth. And so it all becomes increasingly critical that transportation moves the way it needs to move. And it does a pretty good job, I guess. I have a colleague, Bill Anderson, originally from Boston University, who hired him a few years ago as chair of international transport at the University of Windsor. And according to Bill and others who study this, it still costs both our economies in the billions of dollars, the thickening of the border, because it's been institutionalized over time through security practices at the border. And so we have free trade. We have a Canada-U.S. free trade agreement that goes back to 1989. We have the NAFTA, which goes back to 1974. And yet here we are in 2013, and we're still talking about these issues in some ways as if it's almost day one. How are we going to deal with these problems of economic integration? And I think it was raised in the first session, or perhaps it was Ambassador Moss who said this at dinner last night. What is it we want to do through trade agreements and increased economic integration? And you might say, well, economists would say, well, we want to make everybody more prosperous. That's what we want to do. Nothing wrong with that, right? Jobs, prosperity, lower prices, so on and so forth. Everybody's on board for that. that's not the only thing we want to do, presumably. Security considerations, I don't have to tell you, have been very big here in the aftermath of 9/11, bigger than they've been on my side of the border. And I'm not sure how that issue plays in Mexico, but obviously it's very important here. When the European Union was created, back at the old iron and coal, steel community, and then the economic, the European community, and then it became the European Union in the 1990s, and then the monetary union was created, and so on and so forth. But back when it was just a glimmer in the eye of European policymakers in the 1950s, it was created as a solution to the problem of war. And so they look to freer trade to solve problems of international conflict. So I think one of the things that we always need to ask ourselves is, because we're all rushing around, negotiating trade agreements of various sorts. And I was watching my Prime Minister and Jose Manuel Barroso live. Isn't it great what you can do online, right? I got up early and I turned on my computer, and all of a sudden here's the Prime Minister in Brussels, flanked by a couple of other folks, and Barroso was there. And they were talking about the just signed Canada-EU trade agreement, which still has to be ratified. Ambassador Weeks knows this far better than I do. I don't think it'll be a problem in Canada. The provinces will have some say about it, but presumably they've had some input into it. I'm not sure that it's an absolutely done deal when it goes before the European Parliament. I take a group of students to Brussels every year, and we meet with parliamentarians. And Canadians like to think that they're loved around the world. But there are some folks in Europe who don't like us. they don't like the oil sands. They don't like what we think of when it comes to the seal hunt. And that there are some issues that we have. They also think that Canada-US free trade might be a way of smuggling your hormone-laden beef into the European Union, and of course they're against genetically modified organisms and hormones in livestock and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure that it's a done deal, but Barroso seems to think so. So perhaps. So what is it we want to do through these trade agreements? I think that's important. I think many of the things. In fact, what Ambassador Weeks did was, this is challenging. He sort of set this marvelous buffet, and when you have this sort of marvelous buffet, it's hard to know what to take. There's just too much. So I'm just going to grab a couple of things from the buffet, starting with this business of changing business mentality. Well, that's one of the things that can be done through trade integration and trade treaties. And if I can personalize this, one of my brothers, in fact, has a gauge shop in Cambridge, Ontario, which is about an hour and a half from Toronto. And he finds himself looking for business in Mexico. The States, that was already a given, okay? But Mexico, because of the automotive supply chains that link our three economies. Now, I have to say he hasn't been very successful so far, but he's looking and he's spending time there. And I know he's not alone. There are lots of Canadians who are looking for similar possibilities. So it can enlarge your horizons and get you thinking about markets and dealing with suppliers, looking for customers in places where you weren't accustomed to look. Ambassador Weeks also mentioned the Keystone XL pipeline, which, if there are sort of two big issues in Canadian politics, I suppose there are three. One involves senatorial corruption, but oh my God, by American standards, it's so Bush League. I won't bore you with it, okay? But so the two serious issues in Canada, I would say, are Keystone XL and its fate, and there's a lot of talk about Quebec's Charter of Values, which you might find interesting. You might want to Google that and see what that's all about. But on Keystone XL, I've been struck for years now at what I see as an irony, that we can negotiate an umbrella-free trade agreement, but we can't get agreement with our major partner to build a pipeline in order to facilitate the transportation of Canadian oil to refineries on the Gulf. Prime Minister Harper actually had an answer to that this morning, and maybe he's quite right. And Ambassador Weeks, given his involvement in the negotiations, would probably know this. He says, well, in the end, it may be easier to negotiate these comprehensive trade agreements than it is to deal with smaller, specific, and bilateral issues. Perhaps so, perhaps so. I don't know. I think part of what this conference aspires to do, and I think it's happening already, is to arrive at concrete recommendations about the way forward. And I must confess I hadn't thought about this, because perhaps we don't talk very much about the WTO any longer, but Ambassador Weeks proposed that this might be the venue for discussing greater trade integration and partnerships between North America and Latin America. And part of the key would involve identifying strategic incentives that might interest various Latin American countries and get them to the table to talk about such an agreement. I think that's an example of the sort of concrete recommendation that this conference aspires to achieve. And if I can just, I'll just say two things in closing. Dr. Labrucci mentioned, in fact I wrote it down, it struck me. The world looks different from San Antonio than it does from Ottawa or DC. And,
Or Mexico City.
Or Mexico City. And boy, that is true, because I mean, here we are, Canada, the United States, Mexico, and we're part of this NAFTA agreement for almost a couple of decades now, and yet it all looks very different from Canada, I can tell you, than it does from down here in the south of Texas, or from Arizona, or from Southern California. It may have been my friend David Beat who mentioned that the Latino population in Canada is actually very small. We have a very multicultural society. 1 out of 5 Canadians was born outside of Canada. But all the major sources of immigration over the last couple of decades have been from Asia, from South Asia, from East Asia, Southeast Asia, China, the Philippines, Pakistan, India. Those are the major sources of population growth in Canada. And so the issues look different. Immigration, which of course is such an important issue here and plays in a particular way, is not the same issue at all in Canada. And this, I think, complicates the conversation. Canadians were reminded of this when Janet Napolitano was Secretary of Homeland Defense. And early in her tenure, she said, well, we can't treat Canada any differently from Mexico when it comes to border security. Well, every Canadian fell off his or her chair. They thought, well, what are you talking about? The issues are entirely different. Okay, but as a Southwesterner, apparently she was unaware of that. And the Canadian government launched a campaign of education. I don't know how successful it was. David would know better, because I'm sure that some of the folks came to the Canada Institute and talked about these issues. But we were really upset because we thought, oh my God, here's our major trading partner, and they don't understand how different the issues are at the Rio Grande versus Windsor, Detroit, where I live. So it's difficult, I think, to know what the way forward is. I think that security and economic prosperity obviously are the two things that all potential partners to new or enhanced trade agreements want to get out of such agreements. The tricky bit involves how to get there. And if I just make a last comment, I don't think public opinion is the problem. Okay? And just before I came here yesterday, I found some statistics. Where is this from? This is from ECOS, which is a polling company in Canada, headed by Frank Graves. I think it's probably been at the Canada Institute over the years. And ECOS has been tracking support for free trade agreements in Canada and the United States for decades now, and asking people to respond to this question. There should be free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Well, in Canada, back in the 1980s, almost 80% of Canadians said yes. Americans were more dubious. They started to track American opinion in the early 1990s, but still close to 50% of Americans said yes. And then it sort of vacillated up and down. And when the economy did well in the late 90s, then everybody was on board for free trade. It didn't seem to be a boogeyman. It seemed to be okay. Support went up in Canada. Support went up in the United States. and then predictably it's come down since 2008 as our respective economies have encountered turbulence. And but there's still considerable support. It's still up around 50-55% in Canada. It's still around half of Americans. So I don't think public support is the problem. I think the problem to enhance trade agreements, maybe some elites, the nationalist elite in Canada, which Prime Minister Harper thinks is much weaker today than it was in the past. Perhaps he's right. And in your case, I think it may be your domestic political processes, which have just so many veto points and so many opportunities for, I guess, folks that are throwing around the word dysfunctional behavior, or for mischief, really. Okay, the special interests can block good ideas that promise widespread benefits. That may be a problem. I don't know how you overcome that. I don't know how you create an architecture of integration. Ambassador Weeks suggested the WTO would be a starting point to sort of move in that direction, and perhaps so. I'll stop at that.
Okay. Responses by the other two panelists?
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. You brought a number of very good points out, and I'm particularly pleased that you spoke about the security issue, which is something I talk about in a number of times. I make a presentation, but didn't say anything today about it. And I think if you look at the sort of impact of the reaction to 9/11 and how, restrictions that were put in force really to try and protect against terrorism have had the effect of sideswiping a lot of the valuable outcomes from the North American Free Trade Agreement by disrupting is perhaps too strong a word, but maybe not, supply chains. If a good has to go back and forth across the border 5 times because the companies involved have figured out that's the most efficient way to produce it, and probably therefore the most sustainable for those environmentalists in the room, then you don't help North America become more competitive by making it take longer for that good to cross the border each time it gets there. That just doesn't work. And we only benefit our offshore competitors who are shipping us final goods when we do that sort of thing. We're taking away from our own competitive advantages. Now, I happen to think that we should be able, and we've had a number of initiatives to try to do this, but they all kind of floundered because nobody seems to have the staying power to really carry it through. It certainly isn't beyond human ingenuity to figure out how to make smart borders where we can ensure that bad guys don't come across and explosive goods don't come across and drugs don't come across, but legitimate goods do get across and get across efficiently. And I think there's still a lot of room to work on moving that forward. Your reference to Janet Napolitano's comment, I would say also, I think actually in Canada, we sometimes think, why can't we just have a nice discussion with the United States about how to straighten out our border? We tend not to take account of how Mexico looks from the United States. And I think we should probably have another look at whether there aren't some of these issues that really could effectively be addressed on a North American basis, rather than as two separate borders with the United States. And the latest thing, we started having a contest with the Mexicans about who can get ahead and be the most favored child of the United States. And and I see now there's a new high-level dialogue process, political dialogue between the United States and Mexico, involving cabinet officers and so on, that's been really initiated by Vice President Biden, I think. Well, my God, now we're behind again. I think we really need to sort of look at it. If we have an integrated North American marketplace, which to a large extent we do, then I think we should be looking in the first instance at North American solutions for how we deal with the problems that arise. Now, there may be situations where we'll decide, well, we need some differentiation in terms of how we approach this on the two borders. But let's do it that way rather than a priori starting out thinking that it's better to do it separately from the outset. I'd also just briefly, I can't resist a comment on the big versus small in trade negotiations, and you said this was something that Prime Minister Harper said this morning. I must say, I think, and I get this also from my experience in working, I did a lot of work with the National Foreign Trade Council when I was with Sidley Austin in Geneva. They had a project on the go-around. So it was fun working with some of those big companies and the way they thought. And part of the, and to put it in an American context, but you could do the same in a Canadian context. The problem was looking at how big a deal did you need in the WTO Doha negotiations to make it interesting. And basically the problem was quite simple in political terms as these business people looked at it. If they were going to be enthusiastic supporters of an eventual deal, it had to really address the problems that they were concerned about, which involved bringing down foreign barriers to market access by American companies. That was a big part of it anyway. And they needed a big, ambitious outcome to really invest heavily in the fight that would have to take place in the United States after the agreement was concluded to get it ratified through Congress. If it was a minor deal, they wouldn't bother. But the sort of protectionist interests would weigh in just about as heavily, whether it was a very small deal, sort of like the Canadian dairy industry in Canada, EU, we'll watch over the next one. They'd weigh in and say, oh, this is terrible, you can't do this, you know, whether it was a big deal or a small deal. So the protectionists are always going to be there, whether it's big or small. But to get the people who are going to argue as to why it's a good idea out into the field effectively, it's got to be a big deal. And I know we're always saying, oh, well, you know, it's too ambitious. I remember with the FTAA, there was one of the summits in about 2001, or I forget, it was in Quebec City. And this caught Canadians' attention because there were all sorts of demonstrations and people being assaulted by police, and you know, you see the picture. And so I was I remember going to an extended family gathering in which, you know, people knew, here's the trade negotiator, he'll surely have something to tell us about this. So they asked me what I thought about all this, and I said, well, you know, the problem with it is, it's not ambitious enough. We should really be looking at doing this in the WTO rather than just in the Americas. And that just ended the discussion. Because they thought, he's crazy. He's crazy. But anyway, I could go on, but I won't.
I will just be very brief so we can have some questions for the audience. I think as I'm listening to all of this, it occurs to me that, you know, we've just celebrated the 20th anniversary of NAFTA. That's a generation. When we do the volume, I think we need to be looking towards the next 20 years and even predicting the 20 years beyond that. In other words, 1-2 generations out. Because the world really, really does change. And not just the patterns of trade and the composition of the trade, but to go back to one of the comments, I think, by Professor Aleman this morning about generational perceptions. And I will tell you, when I lived in Mexico City in the 1970s, I would sometimes try to pass myself off as Canadian because it was just a lot easier to get what I wanted or needed if people didn't think of me as an American. My husband is in Mexico City right now delivering papers. And he texted me last night that he was dumbfounded that there's a lot of negative press against the Canadians with the mining controversy right now. And he heard some of his counterparts from the 1970s actually making anti-Canadian remarks. Who do they think they are? Are they the new Americans?
The ugly Canadian.
I mean, you know, are we going to end up being the mediators between the Canadians and the Mexicans now? And how absolutely improbable would that have seemed just a very short time ago?
Could I just?
Uh-oh. I didn't mean to offend anybody.
No, that's good comment. But I think the point you made about the need to look ahead,
Yeah.
this is a generational thing. We need to look at the next 20 years and the 20 years beyond that. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what we need to do. You know, to be perfectly frank, we're too goddamn complacent about, you know, what we've got now. And it's not all going to stand still. You know, the next generation has to worry about putting in place improved arrangements that are going to serve us well in the next 20 years and the 20 years after that. And we've got to figure out a way of mobilizing political support for making that happen. Because frankly, it's not there right now.
Why don't we go ahead and open up to the audience?
Well, I was wondering, when y'all drive the free trade agreement with other countries, do y'all look at human rights? Do y'all actually prepare like a rule that you won't buy products using child labor or anybody that works, you know, with wages that can barely live out of? Do you integrate human rights into the draft agreement, or do y'all leave it to individual business to regulate that?
I've never negotiated anything, so I'm not going to answer.
I think that's mostly directed at MSPs.
I used to get more of these questions 20 years ago when I was still in government, so I'm a bit rusty. But, well, first of all, you know, of course, some of the points you raised there are labor related. And I mean, labor elements are now part of all the major trade agreements. So that's something where it's recognized that there needs to be something there. There are also exceptions, even in the basic WTO agreement, coming from the old General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, that was put in place in 1947. There are provisions, for instance, which allow you to break other GATT obligations in order to stop the importation of products of slave labor, for instance, and things like that. So there is recognition of those kind of things. On human rights, I can't think of it. Well, if you gave me a few minutes, well, of course, in some instances, yes, because I mean, slave labor is clearly a violation of human rights. So you know, these things are reflected in trade agreements, not perhaps to the extent that everybody would like. But you know, I don't think government should do everything in one place. You know, we have a very complex international architecture that came out to some extent in our first discussion. But you've got, you know, and conventions on human rights in which these issues are pursued on their own merits in fora particularly dedicated to that. There's an international labor organization which deals with setting up appropriate, what are considered by the members the appropriate standards for labor rights on a global basis. So So yes, they're connected in some ways to trade agreements, and people are thinking about these issues more and more as trade agreements are negotiated. And you know, certainly for instance, China was well on its way to joining the GATT back in the before the end of the Uruguay round, before Tiananmen Square. And when that happened, it just ended that process effectively. That the political repercussions of the Chinese violation of human rights in Tiananmen Square was such that the process of their accession to the GATT, which then became the World Trade Organization, was put back by a good number of years.
Thank you. Going back to the last set of comments, it seems that the example of the reaction to Canadian companies in Mexico is interesting in terms of the relationship between the previous issue about the global and the local, right? Yeah. And it seems to me that there are several contexts now in which Canadian companies, particularly mining companies, gold mining, for example, will probably create some reaction and contention in Latin American locations at the local level. So now, for politicians, to some extent, the worst nightmare is a situation in which you spend a lot of time negotiating free trade agreements and so on, and then you have local revolts against the consequences of those policies. So I guess my question is, if in your experience, do you get any sense of under what conditions politicians anticipate local reactions by their constituencies and then back off from any willingness to negotiate? Under what conditions they, by contrast, they anticipate a good reaction from their constituencies and actually want to do it?
Well, it's certainly a factor, but from my experience, but as to how effective politicians are at doing this, that's a very good question. You know, it's interesting just to make a somewhat related point. You know, we were unclear how important NAFTA might be in terms of the development of trade relations between Canada and Mexico. But, and then I was out of the country for a number of years, and now I've sort of come back and I started, you know, looking at it again from looking at trade statistics on certain. And it's very interesting to look at how in Canadian trade statistics, Mexico, well, you're our third largest source of imports, and I think our fifth largest source of exports. But then you go through individual destination for exports. You go through individual commodities. Mexico is almost always up there. You know, there's the U.S. and maybe there'll be Japan or China, and then there's Mexico as 4 or whatever. It's very, very striking. And I don't think we really anticipated how significant that would be. You know, it started from a very small base, and we knew it was never going to be as big, at least not in the foreseeable future, as big as, say, with the United States. But it's become a very substantial partnership between those two countries, and I think that's happened because of NAFTA. There are always going to be problems of local reactions to, you know, a company doing something or a mining company or whatever, and I think we just have to be mature enough in terms of the evolution of our political relationship that we can manage those sort of things in an appropriate fashion. And I think, you know, with companies are more and more aware of the need to do this properly too, with the growing importance and recognition of the growing importance of corporate social responsibility. There's a price to be paid in terms of their brand and their attractiveness as a company in which shareholders want to hold equity, and a whole range of things if they're seen to be dealing improperly with local populations. Look at the reaction, oh, it's not North America, look at the reaction to these fires and building collapses in Bangladesh in terms of the action that's now been taken by some of the big retailers in the developed world to making sure that better standards are put in place when they're buying clothing from these companies.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. You go ahead.
You know, that question of projecting into the future is so important because, you know, the decisions we make now really can project. There was an interesting book that was written fairly recently by Smick, and it's called "The World is Curved," and he's sort of rejoinder to "The World is Flat." He's saying it's curved in the sense that the horizon is coming up so quickly in terms of change. Is that change comes over the horizon, and it's almost impossible to react because things are so unpredictable and they happen so quickly. And so I guess my question is sort of a projective question, which are always cool because there's no wrong answer. But how would you bring Cuba back into the narrative with all of this, with the world changing so quickly? You can see that it's always sort of the missing character on that buffet when we always talk about that. So what would you expect Cuba to be doing and our relations with Cuba to be?
Really hard to say at this point, I think.
I'm not sure I want to comment on that. I might be accused of interfering in domestic affairs of the United States. But let me, one thought occurs to me. I mean, clearly the situation in Cuba is changing, and I think there's as is the sort of body of thought in the United States about how relations with Cuba should be managed. And just to make one point, to come back to the WTO, for many years now, the United States, did, I forget the name of the term, but actually invoked the provisions of the WTO to sort of disinvoke, the application of WTO provisions as between Cuba and the United States. When that is reinstated, I mean, the United States will already immediately have a trade agreement with Cuba with a whole lot of detailed provisions. It will just sort of come back into force. So I think it's interesting to think about that as one aspect of the answer to your question.
Right.
If I could also respond to your question, not about the Cuba part, but about the first part. That's an interesting metaphor, the world being curved. And I guess that one possibility in order to deal with unexpected things that sort of come over that horizon before you expect them to be there, is to get out of the reactive mode, which I guess is what we're trying to do today, and to look forward. And on that point, I was looking for the opportunity to shill for, I didn't money from this, Diane Francis's book, Merger of the Century, which was just published a couple of weeks ago. It's received a lot of play in Canada. I don't know whether anybody's talked about it in the States yet, but she argues for more or less a full-blown merger between Canada and the United States. And I guess if I were to distill her argument into a sentence, it goes like this. In Canada, we've got the resources. In the States, you've got the innovation, the entrepreneurial spirit. And if we don't act now, China may eat our lunch. So that's basically what the book is about, I think. And it at least it starts a conversation, right? And I mean, that's what we're doing today. We're sort of contributing to this conversation about getting out of the reactive mode so that we don't have to worry about what's coming over that curve and ready to hit us in the forehead.
Maybe one more question? Yeah, go ahead.
What potential do new oil reserve discoveries in Western Hemisphere, such as off the Falkland Islands, have to shape the future relations and nature of trade between the U.S., Canada, and Latin America? And what specific examples could you think of?
Well, that's a good question.
You stumped us.
I think, I don't know how big, frankly, the Falkland Islands saga or the Malvinas has been in terms of trade relations in the Americas. I mean, it's been managed as something that was a serious issue, but it hasn't resulted in, that I'm aware of, in curtailing of trade among countries in the Americas. So, because I think that in the final analysis, everybody involved recognized that wasn't really in their long-term interest to go down that road. The Cuban situation has been different. Clearly, the embargo that the United States led against Cuba was something which did have trade repercussions.
Does.
And
Can
does.
use present
And
tense.
does,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But I can't really think of, off the top of my head, of any other examples.
Well, I think your question sort of goes back to, again, what we were talking about in the first session, which is maybe this whole notion of Latin America is a little bit misleading. I mean, after all, it was the French who first started talking about Latin America in the 19th century. They made it into an entity that none of the individual countries or territories at that point ever believed existed. So, yeah, we need to rethink that and focus some more on these bilateral relations, I think, in looking forward. Yeah.
Okay, in the interest of moving us along, I think it's about time to break. I think we've concluded at an interesting point as we move forward, and that is the issue of we need to redefine a lot of things. And I think this panel pointed toward that. We need to redefine maybe what the concept of security is, what the concept of self-sufficiency is, and the concept of what the hemisphere is. So, do we have any announcements as we go forward? Any announcements as we go forward? Okay. Can we give a round of applause for our...
Thank you. I'm just going to talk a little bit about our lunch, which will be outside. But thank you for handing me a microphone. I just wanted to pick up on something Stephen said that I want to carry through later today. And that is the comparison between how the European Union managed to integrate. And is that possibility even feasible, given some of our discussion today, for North America and Latin America? My field is
I heard about
and one of
this.
the
I read a
things that
reaction.
propelled integration across Europe.
I mean, you can Google it.
Yeah,
Was
no,
that
I
they had
will,
no
I
option.
will, I will.
But it's
Do we have options? Is there some sort of outside force
Yeah.
that will provide the incentive to move us further along in our trade integration? Remember, you know your history, the UK did not join initially the European coal and steel community, and then begged to get in, and was rejected twice. It was their only hope of survival. Is that a fate that we will be confronting someday? Well, and we brought that up with the book that Stephen Brooks just showed us, so maybe it is. Now, let me talk a little bit about our lunch arrangements. Lunch is outside this door, and if you haven't found it yet, it's really quicker to go to the restrooms through this door over here. So really two opposite directions. Now, what you'll see, we have a beautiful room upstairs. Unfortunately, it's under renovation. So what we had to do is put our luncheon spread out over here. Now, if you go out the door here and go all the way to the end and take a left, we have a buffet arrangement set up with the plates and the food and so forth. You take that out, and then we have 4 sets of tables here, and then 4 sets of tables, unfortunately, because of fire marshal reasons, over in that corner. And we didn't want to have assigned seating. What we wanted to do is hope that people will integrate among themselves. We'd very much like the students to sit with some of our presenters so that you get an opportunity to follow up with people who really are world leaders and academics. So please take that opportunity to do so. It is now about almost 10 after 12. We will start with our next session in a little bit about an hour and a half. So we have a good, nice opportunity to sit, be collegial, talk. We decided not to have a luncheon speaker, which I think most people will applaud, so that we do have an opportunity to really follow up on the stimulating discussion that we had today. So I'd like to thank our panelists for a very wonderful